Hello and welcome. Welcome to me, from me, Michael Scott, and from Mike Collins in Maryland to the second event in the new semester in Cultural Encounters Books That Have Made a Difference, where we are bringing together scholars and their audiences in order to explore themes of encounter in literary works and contemporary cultural debates. Father Dominic White, who is our speaker today, studied classics at Pembroke College, Cambridge, at Imperial College London, where he also took his PhD, and was organist and choir director of St Dominic's Priory, London. After studies at Blackfriars, he was ordained deacon and then priest at St Dominic's, London. He was a university and arch chaplain in Newcastle, then bursar in Cambridge, and acting director of research at the Margaret Beaufort Institute of Theology, contributing to teaching and research in the Cambridge University Divinity Faculty. He is the author of The Lost Knowledge of Christ, Christian Cosmology, Contemporary Spiritualities and the Arts, and another book, How Do I Look? Theology in the Age of the Selfie. He is prior and fellow at Blackfriars Hall, and he's now looking forward to building up a new research centre at the Hall for the theology, the arts and the common good. He'll be talking today about Lucy Beckett's novel, A Postcard from the Volcano. I believe that Lucy is with us in the audience today, and I give her a warm welcome. And although we recommend to you reading A Postcard from the Volcano, may I recommend also this book, which is a fine book if you're interested in Christianity and literature. It's called In the Light of Christ, Writings in the Western Tradition, again by Lucy. If any questions occur to you during this talk, please type them in using the Q&A button, not the chat button on your computer. Towards the end, I will ask as many questions as possible for our guests to answer. Please don't leave your questions to the last minute, as we may run out of time. Well, with that, I'm looking forward to the lecture very much. Over to you, Father Dominic.
Thank you very much, Professor Scott. Mike, very honoured to be able to come and speak in this with Georgetown University, and also very honoured that Lucy is in the audience. Lucy, I hope I'll do your wonderful novel justice. I reread it for the third time to prepare this paper, and in fact I slightly changed the title because that's what rereading a book does to you. So it's still substantially the same, but I maybe slightly changed the angles. So now my full title is Telling a True Story, A Postcard from the Volcano, a novel of pre-war Germany by Lucy Beckett. I'm going to just share my PowerPoint. There we are. Introducing a lost story. One reason for telling stories is to tell those stories which have already been forgotten or are generally unknown. Our forgetting or ignorance risks skewing or distorting our perception of reality. So such stories are necessarily different and other to our current perceptions. Lucy Beckett's great novel of ideas is a story of a vanished world of a common German language and culture in a multi-ethnic region of Europe at a time of polarization and extremism, which is very relevant to our own time when extremism is on the rise and might even win. Two of the three sections of A Postcard from the Volcano are set in the German city of Breslau, which cannot be found on a map of modern Germany. This is not because Breslau is imaginary, but because it's no longer in Germany. Today it's Wrocław, Poland's third largest city. So the subtitle, A Novel of Pre-War Germany, is not just about a lost time, but a lost place. Rupert Short gave me Lucy Beckett's novel after a conversation we had about some Berliner friends of mine who had surprised me with their own family stories of being refugees. Like perhaps most British people who have studied history until the age of 16, I knew that until the end of the First World War in 1918, Central Europe was divided between the Prussian, Austro-Hungarian and Russian empires. The Poles, Czechs and Slovaks did not have their own independent countries. After the defeat and collapse of Prussia and Austro-Hungary, and of course the Russian Revolution, I'd assumed that Germany had retreated to what is its current eastern border, the Oder-Neisse line, where the arrow is, which I believe was its actual ethnic border. Of course, I knew that subsequently Hitler had invaded Czechoslovakia and Poland, perpetrated the Holocaust, and then after the war, Germany was divided in two. But then one friend, a choreographer, told me how she had recently been unsuccessful in a funding bid for a dance work about the expulsion of the majority of the German population of Lower Silesia after its transfer to Poland in 1945, and this included her own grandmother. Many of the Silesian Germans could trace their presence there back to the 13th century. Historically, Silesia had successively and variously been part of Bohemia, Poland, the Habsburg Empire, and the Prussian Empire. At the end of World War I, part of hitherto German territory became the western and northern parts of Poland, with Gdansk, Danzig, becoming a free city. Following unrest and the plebiscite of 1921, parts of Upper Silesia returned to Poland, and some of the German population left. In 1945, the Potsdam Agreement transferred Lower Silesia and Pomerania to Poland in compensation for the annexation of Galicia in eastern Poland by the Soviet Union, whose Polish population was to be transferred to the areas vacated by the Germans. The expulsions, which included established ethnic German communities from further east in Poland, East Prussia, divided unequally between the USSR and Poland, and the then Czechoslovakia, were largely overseen by Soviet soldiers and were marked by atrocities. But the story was too controversial, said the potential funders of my friend's dance work. Yes, Germans were violently expelled, but Germany was the aggressor in World War II. Portraying them as victims looked like mitigating Nazi guilt. Other German friends with Eastern European roots told me similar stories. They were as disgusted by Nazism as most modern Germans, but felt that their family stories were not only untold, but forbidden. As I listened more to these untold and untellable stories, I started to see a whole transgenerational trauma. Stories need telling with care and context. In fact, A Postcard from the Volcano is an extended fictionalization through the character of Max von Hofmannswaldau of the first 28 years of one of the author's own teachers, a Silesian Junker, a member of the Prussian German landed aristocracy. This Junker also had a Jewish mother, an intellectual and musician who had studied at Breslau's best gymnasium and then qualified as a lawyer at its university. He lost his career to Hitler's racial laws and fled to England. He was interned at the outbreak of World War II, then joined the Royal Pioneer Corps after the war, becoming a teacher, and died in 1961, aged just 56. Having had to flee Germany as a Jew, he could not return home as a German because his home was now in Poland. Unlike Max, he did not become a Catholic, although Max, by the end of the novel, is a troubled Catholic, scandalized and then lapsed after experiencing clergy who side publicly with the Nazis. But this what if is the context for a novel of ideas in which young Max and his friends of single or mixed German, Jewish, Polish, and Austrian heritage, Catholic, Jewish, and Protestant religions, none of them actually practicing, grapple with the great questions, most fundamentally the question of religious faith, mediated through philosophy, literature, and music. It's very much not a story of privileged young intellectuals wallowing in existential ennui or divine discontent. And it goes much further than the overcoming of postmodern literary criticism by good old-fashioned romance in A.S. Byatt's beautiful neo-Victorian novel Possession. Rather, Beckett's characters debate the great questions as the reality of rising Nazism impinges on their lives amid an extremely complex socio-political situation, evidenced in their own ethnic and religious mix. Ideas are incarnate in their lives, sometimes terrifyingly so. In our time of silos and slogans and the machine of othering which these generate, Beckett refuses to simplify. For example, early on we learn that Max's own village, Waldau, fictional, but it could easily be St. Peter Waldau, modern Pieszczce, is inhabited not just by Germans, but also by Polish Catholics and a small Jewish community. Emilia, the nanny and cook, is a Pole, and Max knows some basic Polish. Neither does the novel consist simply of exposing the totalitarian ideologies of Prussian imperialism, Nazism, and Marxism as failure, nor does it argue a political case for which country Silesia should belong to. Nor again is it a story only of the petty failings and often greater kindnesses between ethnically and religiously diverse neighbours, such as the Greek Christians and Turkish Muslims in Louis de Bernier's Birds Without Wings, set in Asia Minor in and around the Great Greco-Turkish War of 1922, or the mixed Jewish, Christian and Muslim community of World War II Sarajevo in Geraldine Brooks' People of the Book. Such local stories are included by Beckett, though with a rare empathy for the context of even the worst characters. But key are the novel's long, passionate and nuanced dialogues, Platonic and scholastic in their inspiration and brilliance, and school, university and living room in their context. The author was head of classics at Ampleforth College for many years. All this makes A Postcard from the Volcano very difficult to summarize and even more to reduce. The arts play a key role in these debates so that reality can never be reduced to mere words. With its tripartite structure, broad chapters and complex layers, the novel has a symphonic sweep. On true stories. So this is a lost story. Can it be a true story, given that without the full truths, our perception of reality is skewed? Quote, in the winter of 1961, Max Hoffmann was dying. So the novel begins with the end of a story, a death, just as its sequel, The Leaves Are Falling, is the story of a dying man. And death means the protagonist can no longer tell his story. Max, the violin teacher, leaves his violin to his favourite pupil. Many years ago it belonged to a good man. It will improve your playing. He briefly recounts his flight from Hitler's Germany, his wartime experience in Britain, meeting his wife. Then, quote, this life that is lost, that will be altogether finally lost or not when I die. You will find it, discover it, even invent it. What is the difference? I leave it to you, what to do to find it, because you have the application and the imagination and the sense for truth. Perhaps imagination and the sense for truth are even after all the same thing. Resisting what seems an impossible task, the pupil says, surely you're friends. Max asks her to take a postcard out from his drawer, and she reads on it 6 names. All are dead except Max. Hitler killed all of us, or Stalin, even me. This will be a game, the story a good one, quite complicated. The pupil agrees to the task one day. Then, to everyone's surprise, it turns out Max was a Catholic. He asks for the priest and has a Latin Requiem Mass, which none of his family and colleagues can follow. And his widow, unknowing of her husband's wish, sells the violin. So the pupil is left only with a story she does not know, 6 names on a postcard. The title of the novel is taken from a poem of Wallace Stevens, which, along with a quotation from the Silesian poet Joseph von Eichendorff, meditates on how we will be unknown when we are dead. But how can imagining what we don't know ever be true? Of course, for any historical novel, one does research, which is exactly what Lucy Beckett did for this novel, and The Leaves Are Falling, in which, at his request, the narrator writes the unknown last days of a dying man's father, who is in fact Jakob Halpen, a character in Postcard. But in A Postcard from the Volcano, the author challenges and shifts the truth versus fiction debate by making it a novel about people searching for truth, and with ever more urgency as their world collapses around them and their lives are threatened. There is a shift from narrator to revelator, revealing deeper fundamental truths through stories of events which are often apocalyptic in every sense. Essential to this is open-ended conversation, in contrast to monologues which foreclose conversation, and the inclusion of what is beyond words, such as music. For example, when Max and his friends Adam Zapolsky and Joachim von Treuburg are student flatmates in Breslau in the mid-1920s, they're looking for more musicians to make a string quartet. They're invited to the 21st birthday party of the glamorous but determinedly superficial Eva Grossmann, an art student who is Treuburg's lover. Her father, the surgeon Professor Grossmann, rich, ostentatiously patriotic and successful, addresses each of the young men in turn. He chides Treuburg for wanting to be an army doctor back home in impoverished East Prussia. More ambition, Baron, more ambition. There's no reason to suppose there'll be another war, is there? He doesn't wait for an answer. This is not a conversation. But then Grossmann's surgical assistant, Jakob Halpern, plays Brahms's first violin sonata, accompanied by Eva. His playing was precise, wonderfully in tune and passionate, but at the same time reticent, as if the music, given more freedom, would have been too much for him, for the room, for the occasion. Whereas, although Ava got most of the notes, the piece was really too difficult for Ava. She was so keen to demonstrate her mastery of it that she wasn't actually listening to Halpern's playing, let alone accompanying it. Ava will turn out to be another laconic non-listener, along with Adam's Nazi-sympathizing mother. Catherine Pickstock, in her analysis of traditional liturgical language, contrasts its heavy use of subordinating and coordinating conjunctions with modernity's love of a syndeton, syntax with no subordinating conjunctions, which apparently offers an unmediated and simple presentation of reality, but actually renders the subject passive and reality inert. In the end, we feel only a lack and a dim apprehension of control. But traditional liturgical language, such as in the Creed, is full of conjunctions, e.g., through whom all things were made. As Pickstock says, entwining these two persons of the Trinity, the Father and the Son, in complex coordination and reciprocal subordination, and reflecting a sacral universe in which all elements form a constitutive part of the greater whole and recall each other. Only in the words of institution, take, eat, does a syndeton enter the liturgy, exceeding the necessary finitude of the conjunctions of human language, and thus guarding against totalization. We will return to this later when Max and Anna encounter the Mass, but meanwhile, conjunctive speech emerges as a language of relation and community. And that's what happens when these young people gather to play music together. Jakob brings a violist, his younger sister Anna. They are Jewish, from Vilna, then in Poland, now Vilnius, Lithuania. Gruff and reserved, Jakob comes alive at the sight of Max's grandfather's harpsichord, and they play hide and seek second string quartet together. But Jakob is touchy, and when asked why he didn't study in Vilna, concludes that he's not welcome. But music smooths things between them, and he agrees to his sister's request that they come again. The second time, much will have happened. Max has fallen in love with Anna, and they've discussed Shakespeare and anti-Semitism with Adam and Max's old teacher, Dr. Fisher, a Catholic, over tea. Was Shakespeare an anti-Semite, or did he actually portray Jews as victims of the sin of contempt? Max's grandfather's old cleaner, Frau Gärtner, apologizes that she can't come anymore. My son will not allow me because you have Jews visiting. Adam has acted in Hamlet, has become Hamlet in a contemporary production calling out rising totalitarianism. Adam's mother has socially cut Jakob and Anna because they are Jewish. Adam has done some diplomacy and they're back now, this time playing Mozart's clarinet quintet. But Jakob is in a bad mood. Anna has fallen in love with Adam following his Hamlet performance and is distracted in her playing, and Jakob is harsh with her. Another theme emerges with Anna under her brother's thumb and Frau Gärtner's under her son's, the othering of women by men and the exclusion of women socially and politically, much as has been done to Jews. It is a more difficult evening, and after the slow movement, Jakob speaks at great length on the failure of religion, Marxism, and art to save the poor, and Nietzsche, formerly Adam's hero, is revealed as an anti-Semite. Jakob puts his trust in brain medicine and possible experiments on the effects of music on the brain. He turns to the Bolsheviks' attacks on the Jews as quote-unquote capitalists. Then Halpern stopped, looked round at Adam, Max, Treuburg, and drained his mug of beer. I apologize, Hoffmannswaldau. You invited us to play Mozart, a civilized evening. Why not? I have spoilt it. This is Germany, not Russia. Please, Max said, don't apologize. Halpern put his arm round his sister. She looked up at him and smiled, the first time in the evening she had smiled. Anna and I grew up in Russia. This seemingly incidental moment, the kind overcoming of a moment of social awkwardness, is, I suggest, key to the novel. In letting Jakob continue, in spite of his own asyndetic speech, in not foreclosing the conversation, a healing happens. Jakob leaves his grand schemes, relates lovingly to his sister, note the conjunctive Anna and I, embodied in embrace, and he speaks his own truth about what makes him so prickly. He tells the story of the anti-Semitism they both experienced back home and the strategy of assimilation. Adam tells the story of goodwill on his father's estate in the Habsburg Empire. I think it was because the empire was such a mixture, so many people, so many languages, he says. Totalities have been abandoned for embracing an infinity. Adam puts this into practice. Years later, he brings Max to visit the remains of his country estate. The house was burnt down by the Russians, the priest and the rabbi murdered, the women raped. The synagogue scrolls were saved, entrusted to a Gentile farmer who brought them back when the war was over. The friends stay in a Jewish inn where they are warmly welcomed. Adam speaks Yiddish. He resists the demands of his mother's Viennese agent, Herr Schickelmeier, for rent from the poor Jewish immigrants from the East. Adam's mother was conspicuous by her absence when the peasants were starving. Mrs. Sabok, a Polish peasant, gives them a warm welcome but resents her seemingly better off Jewish neighbours. Adam comments to Max, "I suppose the very poor will always blame the slightly less poor for doing a bit better, because the Jews teach their children to read, work hard, and they drink less." This is not a revisionist history, but it is the retelling of a story which might otherwise disappear, in which the Poles, as a nation and as a whole, become demonized as a nation of anti-Semites. These are stories not just of the powerful, but of small acts of kindness which can transform and heal beyond the reach of political violence. Mrs. Sabok's attitudes are not condoned or justified, but they are contextualized in the mystery of sin. We see this with many of the disagreeable characters. Max's father is a difficult man. He believes in military Prussia as God's chosen nation for ruling the lazy and incompetent other peoples of Central and Eastern Europe, and gives Max no choice about following his brothers into the army. Yet, as Germany unravels after defeat, and the angry, hungry demob soldiers turn bandits, fire on the Polish inhabitants of the village, his father is killed as he tries to intervene and protect the Poles. The totalizing vision of Prussia has collapsed, but Max's father's humanity shines more brightly. Max's mother is a gentle and seemingly saintly figure, a fine musician who supports Max's violin lessons with the Jewish live-in tutor, Dr. Mendel, while his father doesn't want to hear him play. But as the story goes on, there are hints that there was more to Max's mother's relationship with Dr. Mendel than met the eye. Before she dies young of heart disease, Max's surviving brother Heinrich has married Betsy, the daughter of a super-rich, hardline nationalist industrialist. They are unpleasant and vulgar, and push the mother aside, substituting brash American jazz on the gramophone for Schubert on the piano. Yet Heinrich admits to the insightful Max that he married Betsy to save the hopelessly indebted estate. Amid a nasty clash between Heinrich, the totalizing nationalist and Nazi, and Polish-Austrian Adam, we see Heinrich's hurt at his brother's death in the war and the humiliation of defeat. And Eva, promiscuous rich girl, art student, Jewish but determinedly assimilated to the point of racism towards the poor Jews from the East, reveals a complete disconnect between her jazzy words and the hollow, distorted faces of her expressionist canvases. During Max's lonely working years, when he has only Treuburg for company in the flat, she seduces him. There is a moment when Max shuts down what could have been a saving conversation. While they are walking in the country, she sees some black rock which she would like to cover in bright geometric patterns, a surprise masterpiece for anyone walking so far. For Max, it's good enough as it is. Eva says, "I have teachers who would find ways of painting or perhaps making a sculpture out of the wild just to make a gesture of solidarity with the wilderness. Do you see?" He didn't. What might have happened if Max had asked her what painting the rocks was about? But at that moment he's missing Adam, and Eva is a compensation. He does not love her. The new flatmate, Stern, a secular Jew from Prague, is idealistic in his embrace of Soviet Marxism, yet he has no malice. Even Frau Hübner, the grumpy charwoman, practicing Protestant who lives in the basement of Max's block in Breslau and becomes an enthusiastic Nazi, is shown to us as a woman living a hard life with her depressed husband who cannot work, having lost both legs in the war, and their son finds work with the Nazis. None of this is excused. There is no token good Nazi, nor does Beckett resort to a postmodern multiplicity of narratives which are not to be reconciled. That is a luxury the characters of the novel cannot afford, when beliefs become a life or death issue. Music and dialogue. Music is a golden thread through the book, from Max's childhood violin lessons with Dr. Mendel to the final Bach chaconne he plays in memory of Dr. Mendel and his flatmate Stern, alone in his flat, not long before he himself will have to flee. It will be tempting to see music as having an alchemical function in a novel. Where words are clearly limited and even fail, somehow music makes everything right. Max's grandfather, Professor Meyer, a doctor and a Jew baptized out of political expediency, but not religious, had put his faith in science, but lost this following the invention of poison gas in World War I. As he and Max make a harpsichord together, Professor Meyer says he now puts his faith in art, quote, as telling us about something else, something outside us and beyond our comprehension, that somehow makes our lives worth living. Not in God as religious people understand the word, but something that might be called God because it is mysterious, seems truly good, and demands loyalty and dedication. Yet we soon discover that music too is limited and can be deeply flawed and manipulated. As teenagers at school in Breslau, Max's friend Adam invites him to a performance of Wagner's Tristan and Isolde. Wagner, whose operas have already been a subject of discussion for Max, is encountered live for the first time as Adam explores alcohol and is pushing for encounters with girls. Max is left dazed, drunk on wine and the stormy passions the music has awakened, as his attachment to Adam becomes emotionally intense. Much later, Dr. Fischer, Max's and Adam's inspirational teacher, devout Bavarian Catholic, passionate adherent of the political centre, and an epitome of fair-mindedness and decency, will admit to Max that he had planned to give up the girl he loved and become a priest, which an old priest had dismissed as a lot of Wagnerian nonsense. You marry her and find your way to God with her beside you. And by the time Max and Dr. Fischer have this conversation, the Nazis are building a new religion by mixing Christianity and Wagner. We will return to this. So just as Lucy Beckett refuses to reduce our encounter with reality to words, so she will not allow art to degenerate into emotive solipsism. Max invites Adam to lunch with his grandfather, and they discuss Walter Rathenau, the German foreign minister, national hero for getting the fairest terms he could for Germany after World War I, but recently assassinated because he was Jewish. Rathenau had argued that the war was the fault of 200 old men who knew each other. For Rathenau, Bach, Goethe, Rembrandt, and Shakespeare were evangelists of the German soul. But Adam says culture hasn't worked since the intelligentsia stopped believing in God. Dr. Rathenau's 200 old men, he says, I bet they all love Bach and Goethe. Something different happens when Max encounters Bach's St. Matthew Passion. But first, having set all these hermeneutical caveats, we must turn to the philosophical debates through the book. The first significant discussion is Max's shock discovery while still a child that someone close to Max is other. Dr. Mendel, his tutor, is a Jew. How can this be when he doesn't look like the poor Jewish migrants in Breslau Market? He doesn't come to church, where the pastor reassures everyone that God is on the side of the Germans. Max's mother reassures him that Dr. Mendel, originally from French Alsace, is as German as we all are. She, of course, says nothing about her own ethnicity. Next, it will be World War I. Dr. Mendel explains to Max the assassination of the Archduke in Sarajevo and the ethnic complexity of Bosnia. The assassins, if they are executed, will not be martyrs. He says, a martyr is a witness to the truth. Whether Bosnia is a part of Serbia or part of the empire is not a matter of truth, but a matter of politics. Then, having lost his brother Freddie in the war and his father shortly after, Max moves to Breslau to attend the gymnasium. He's now 17. The schoolroom is a scene of impassioned debate around Kant, Hegel, and Nietzsche, the Bible, and Virgil, under the watchful eye of Dr. Fischer. In spite of Dr. Mendel's historically motivated fears about the Catholic Fischer, the latter does not try to stop his pupils from thinking, though he does challenge their ideas and employs the canon as a resource for facing contemporary questions. He is something of a Fischer of men. Plato and his Republic with its philosopher king are applied to the new emerging German Republic. Adam Sapolsky is cynical about truth, advocating instead the bread and circuses approach, until Dr. Fischer asks him what power is for and the dangers of signing off governmental responsibility to others. Truth, goodness, and beauty start to emerge. Virgil's fourth eclogue is interpreted in the tradition of a messianic prophecy by Fischer. Sapolsky counters with a hard atheist materialism, attacking Kant's and Hegel's philosophical conceptions of God as well as Christian faith. Fischer, while defending the view that Virgil may have read the Jewish scriptures in the Greek Septuagint, nevertheless holds that the central question is Jesus' question, who do you say that I am? Later, of course, Adam will play Hamlet and be put on his own trajectory of decision as he has to face in himself Hamlet's affliction of his father's death and his mother's disloyalty. This will change him. But for now, he sticks to what, to his irritation, Dr. Fisher has called his present position, that Jesus was just a man and that God doesn't exist. People have believed in God and made a mess. What rescue did there turn out to be? Asked Adam. So Fisher says that it was no rescue as a magic trick performed by God, but the gift of grace, which, like faith, can be ignored or refused, or like intelligence, can be very seriously misused. Fisher emphasizes responsibility, while the alternatives seem to be the will to power. Adam is an enthusiastic reader of Nietzsche, or Schopenhauerian pessimism and withdrawal. Max, as a teenager, is experiencing an intense love for his friend Adam, which Beckett is careful not to define, a love which could be dangerous. Whether Adam, driven by philosophical inquiry, actually notices it or is simply tactful is not initially clear. But this love frames their discussion of Plato's Phaedrus and the tragedy of Antigone. On the last day of the summer holidays, they've gone riding in the country, and they speak of love, the wings of the soul in the Phaedrus, and the two horses, the beautiful and good one on one side, and the bad one of sensuous, jealous love pulling against each other. And of Plato's connection of love with God. Is this knowledge or just belief? Max would like to believe it, but Adam is worried about how belief in empires and either believing in God being on our side or just using that idea led to slaughter. But Max, surely speaking from the experience of his own self-restraint, understands the goodness of the sacrifice of what's selfish and out of control. Adam counters, of course, it's a beautiful idea, but is it true? So Adam is brought to the question of having the choice either of materialism and Schopenhauerian pessimism, or whether to decide to believe in God. Then they break the discussion. In a natural amphitheatre, Adam declaims Antigone's speech as she prepares for her entombment instead of marrying Creon's son. Max rushes down the hill, slips, and Adam breaks his fall, but does not embrace him. Max realizes that Adam had saved him from embarrassment. He reflects, Adam realized everything. That was why it was complete rubbish for him to pretend to be a materialist. They have a lovely evening of music, and the next day, Max's mother, soon to die of incurable heart disease, warns her son not to frighten Adam off. That's the end of part one. In part two, Adam, Max, and another student, Joachim von Treuburg, are at university and sharing Max's grandfather's flat, grandfather having passed away a little before. This is a time, as we saw above, of quartets and the great debate about failed ideas, the damage done by Nietzsche, in particular his anti-Semitism, the difference between facts and truth, and Max's hospitality, which enables the prickly Jakob Halpern to speak his own truth. Max is now wanting religion to be true, as is noticed by Anna, his beloved. In terms of our own reading of the novel, this enables the shift of reading the story of a vanished world, whose facts beyond the bare bones and a few names have been lost with the death of Max Hoffman, to the work of imagination, which is the truth of the story. The debates end with summer. In a scene which recalls Evelyn Waugh's Brideshead Revisited, Adam and Max, who are of the same generation as Waugh's Charles and Sebastian, go to Venice to join Adam's mother and her latest friend. Symbolically, they reject the decadence of Thomas Mann's death in Venice. In Brideshead, we get memory and impression. Cara, Lord Marchmain's mistress, complains that he's never even taken her to St. Mark's, so she enlists a Venetian nobleman to show the boys what the narrator describes as the immense splendor of the place. But for Charles, it's all aesthetic impression of sunlight on the sands, cool marble interiors, water lapping on the stones, and Lord Byron. And Cara and Charles talk of love. Cara is very frank about the boys' relationship. Whereas Adam and Max have already been through the Phaedrus process. Now they visit churches. They look at Titian's presentation of the Virgin at the Accademia, and Max starts to be seduced by Catholicism, according to Adam, noting how half the inhabitants of Breslau are Catholics but keep their heads down. Max claims he was inoculated by a small dose when he was young. And they see Ravenna, the frescoes. Virgins and martyrs, Adam said. Those were the days when it was clear how to live. You don't mean that, don't I? They go into San Vitale and find a funeral taking place. This brings Max back to his brothers and father's funerals. He suddenly wished Anna were beside him, who had never been to Mass, and who, he guessed, but guessed with a kind of certainty, would have loved the candles and the incense, and the mysterious presence of God, but almost needing Adam to know it's all nonsense. They kneel like everyone else, and Adam crosses himself, Hamlet. Next day they go to Torcello, the Virgin Mother and child, her eyes pleading, Max thought, and reproachful. Don't harm my child, you will. Perhaps they don't know whether it's all true or made up. But now Max needs to know whether it's true. Then the separation begins. Adam moves his studies to Krakow after Breslau University offers him an academic job to, quote unquote, discover that the Aryan Germans are the original race of Eastern Europe. But in fact, the final push for Adam is his experience at Krakow Cathedral on the Feast of the Holy Cross. It makes you stop what you're doing and look up, a Christ on the cross high over us all. Moved by Cardinal Sapieha's sermon, Adam went to confession, experienced huge relief, and has decided to train for the Catholic priesthood. Max is shocked and upset as this has rocked his whole world, but he admits if facts aren't worth dying for, they're not worth living for either. Or was the beauty of the churches in Venice just a consolation in the desert of the truth? Adam accepts it could all be false, but either God became man to redeem the world from its own sinfulness, or man is all of God there is. His decision is surprisingly well received by apparently atheist Jakob Halpern, who reflects that the world needs not just education, but also the wisdom of the rabbis and the best of the Christian priests. Dr. Fisher sees Adam's intellectual struggles as a struggle with God in a world which, since the war, has lost its certainty. Dr. Fisher, perhaps reflecting Eric Voegelin, sees God as being replaced by Hitler and both right and left as failing to recognize human fallibility and thus the human need for God's grace. The ideologies have become the absolutes, replacing the absolutes of the truth, goodness, and beauty of God. To apply a more modern analysis to Dr. Fisher's words, in the ideologies there is a refusal of the other. They are totalizing systems, while God's grace holds us together individually and communally in our mutual otherness. Fisher encourages Max in his courtship of Anna and encourages him to explore Catholicism. While the debates don't completely end at this point, the book takes a different direction now. Opera and theatre are replaced by the St. Matthew Passion of Bach. Max rehearses with an orchestra in preparation for an English tour, which will be in more senses than one his salvation. And the great theatre of liturgy. As he explores Catholicism more, Max takes Anna to Mass. Neither of them understand much of it, but Anna is both pleasantly surprised during the Lenten liturgy that the priest denounces a rising Semitism and reminds the congregation that salvation comes from the Jews. Perhaps, going by the way of beauty, she reflects on the sense of holiness and the presence of God, the parallel between the Hebrew prayers at her synagogue at home and the Latin in the Mass here, as opposed to German prayers in the highly assimilated Breslau Reform Synagogue. She says, but they seem just now the Latin and the quietness, real prayers for God, to God. The finitude of language has been breached in a gesture to the infinite. As Catherine Pickstock says in liturgical language, it is apophatic and transcendent in its otherness, becoming doxology, communal praise. And they see a Jewish-Christian continuity in the Passover Mass and Tabernacle Ark parallels. They agree to marry. Max will be back on Holy Saturday after his St. Matthew Passion Tour, which is splendid. His host, the Anglican Canon Davidson, speaks good German, having studied in Heidelberg as a student, hosted by a Jewish family. But in part 3, beginning in the summer of 1930, with Max at work in the courts as an assessor, we eventually learn how, during his absence, Anna went to Mass, facing an anti-Semitic diatribe in place of a sermon, and then her brother finds out she went to Mass and her plan to marry Max. He sends her straight back to Vilna. Max is by now a Catholic, though his relationship with the church is troubled because of anti-Semitism, complicated by his affair with Eva, and then, when she falls pregnant, his inability to forgive her for aborting their child. He comes to Adam's ordination. Adam helps him reconcile with the church and to forgive Eva. Max hears Hitler's speech in Breslau, which he realizes is manipulative theatre, and spots his brother Heinrich among the SS. The weakness of Cardinal Bertrand, Archbishop of Breslau, Catholics siding with the Nazis because they're the enemies of the communists, and another anti-Semitic sermon all deeply trouble Max when he is doing all he can as a citizen to break the boycott of Jewish shops and as a lawyer to resist lawlessness. Then he goes to Mass on Passion Sunday, only for the priest to hurl more abuse at the Jews. And on Palm Sunday, the stormtroopers are in the procession. Adam writes him an encouraging letter, and Dr. Fisher, recalling wistfully how once there were Germans with their wonderful music everywhere, even in St. Petersburg, much like the Jews, encourages Max to stay in the church, which is wider than Germany. He says, "Bishops and priests are not necessarily braver or wiser than anyone else, I'm afraid. The church is divine and will prevail. The church is human and will fail." But Max's departure from the church is decisive this time, only to return on his deathbed. So this is no Catholic novel of conversion followed by happily ever after. Yet it is a novel of the Passion and a strange salvation. By playing in England in the St. Matthew Passion performance, a sublime fusion of divine and human word with music, Max, when his own maternal Jewish heritage leads to the loss of his job, gets tutoring work with Canon Davidson. Thus he's able to save his life, flee Germany, albeit at great price. Truth, imagination, and revelation. Amid tragedy, Lucy Beckett always gives us a sense of something greater at work, just as in the Book of Revelation, the sufferings and wars of the world are seen in the context of the drama of salvation. How the novel does this is hard to define. As I said at the beginning, this long novel is very difficult to summarize, still more to reduce. If I can include an element of autoethnography, it reminds me of watching Terrence Malick's film A Hidden Life with some of my fellow Dominicans. This recent biopic of the life of Blessed Franz Jägerstätter, an Austrian conscientious objector and martyr of the Second World War, lasts 2 hours and 54 minutes, yet none of us thought it was too long. Not a single frame, it seemed, was wasted. And what it has in common with A Postcard from the Volcano is grandeur. The filmmaker and the novelist, through beauty and narrative skill, make us aware of a greater truth. Not that Catholics have the truth, but rather that the truth has them. Max is held invisibly through all the tragedy, the death of his friends, and his death quite literally from a broken heart. But this is also his moment of return to the church. This is the twitch upon the thread of the last chapter of Brideshead Revisited, but without the bitterness. Beckett's vision is greater than Evelyn Waugh's. Not just beauty, but beauty, truth, and goodness in a dance in which these transcendentals, different and other from each other, are neither individually totalized nor set in opposition. Beauty does not become self-indulgent aestheticism, truth does not become ideology, and goodness does not become a humanism unsustainable because it tries to function without grace. And words become inadequate without art. And all this is revealed in the complex and therefore plausible characters of this novel of truth, and a vision of the church which is dynamic in a more hopeful vision of salvation than the church of Max's time, which consigned his unbaptized child to a hypothetical limbo. Lucy Beckett, in her rapprochement with Judaism and her hopefulness about salvation, offers a post-Vatican II Christian humanism. Yet, in recalling ancient forms of liturgy in their transcendental and connective language, offers a gentle critique of hurried liturgical reform. Along with her foundation of the story in the canon of Western literature and philosophy, one might call her approach one of progressive traditionalism. But this is above all not a treatise, but a novel. Lucy Beckett narrates a lost story of a vanished time and place. As we saw, when a story is untold, our view of reality is skewed, and trauma passes from generation to generation when the story is forgotten or forbidden. In our own time, some of Generation Z are returning to Christianity, according to a Bible Society study. As one Gen Z put it to me, nothing else works. This is, in a sense, the journey of Max and Adam, and their story from the 1920s and 30s is repeating itself now, when secular liberalism has not delivered paradise, humanism looks weak, and extreme ideologies are rising on both right and left, sometimes invoking Christianity and distorting it. Whereas Lucy Beckett, applying imagination to real but often forgotten historical facts, validates Max's words to his young student as he lays dying. Perhaps imagination and the sense for truth are even after all the same thing. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Father Dominic. I'll just get my video on if I can. Great. Thank you for an interesting and I have to say a rather taxing job we gave to you, because it is a long novel and a complex novel. I say we gave to you, but you actually chose it for yourself. So
I
perhaps
never go by the
I'll
easy
have
route,
no
I'm afraid,
mercy.
Mike.
No mercy on that at all. There's a question come in from Carol Grobicki. How did listening to people's stories, where you recognized an example of transgenerational trauma, inform your third reading of the novel? Does the novel suggest a breakdown of the relationship between sacred and secular history, meaning a framework has to be constructed to make sense of the character's own sense of subjective meaning?
Wow. I think that's a very, very good question. I mean, as I say, my friend's stories very much moved me, because if you can't tell a story and you're picking up other people's pieces, inevitably that will color your life. It will color how you are with people, with the next generation, until the story can be sold. And I think it is happening now. There are some joint studies, for example, between Germans and Poles on the post-Potsdam displacements. I think it is true that the sacred and the secular are distinct, but that they actually do need each other. I mean, we can't just live in church, but equally, we cannot just live our daily lives and not seek the deeper meaning of things. Otherwise, life becomes meaningless. The sacred has a way of ambushing us, and it is a tension. My confrere Cardinal Timothy Radcliffe speaks a lot about creative tension. And I think there is a very strong creative tension between sacred and secular in the novel. And it doesn't resolve tidily. I find it a magnificently uncomfortable novel in some ways. It's a bit like a Mahler symphony, which is fantastic, but it doesn't, it doesn't just neatly resolve all the issues. But you are left with a sense of something greater and maybe unnameable. Ineffable maybe is a better word, something ineffable which holds it all together.
Thanks so much for that. So are you saying that within the context of our series, the primary cultural encounter within this book is between the sacred and the secular?
I think what I liked about it most, I mean, the big danger of novels of ideas is that you just end up with cardboard characters. People sometimes accuse T.S. Eliot in his later plays of just having cardboard characters, sort of middle class English figures, who would just be mouthpieces for grand discourses on ideas. I mean, I think that's criticism is not entirely fair. Think of his last play, The Elder Statesman, for example. But I think there's something in it as well. I mean, I think that the very strong collision in the novel is of ideas, whether sacred or secular, with real people and their lives, with the messiness of lives. One might, to borrow a term from theology, speak of the incarnation of ideas in lives. And they're not like, as I said, it's not divine discontent or existential ennui of privileged young people for whom this actually doesn't cost very much. Actually, it costs everything. And for me, that's what's most powerful. It's the incarnation of ideas in human lives.
Thanks for that. Mike Collins, who's wonderful on T.S. Eliot. Mike, what do you make of that?
I understand entirely what you mean. That is certainly part of the criticism of Eliot's plays. But what sometimes happens, I think, on the stage is because those, to use your word, cardboard characters are embodied by flesh and blood actors, that they tend that sense of manipulation, allegorical manipulation that we sense in Eliot reading. I'm thinking primarily now of The Cocktail Party, which we sense, everybody's doing what they're supposed to do in order to illustrate Eliot's Christian vision of the world. When you get them on the stage, however, and those characters are embodied by flesh and blood actors, I think that tends to bring a more realistic dimension, if you like, to the play. Certainly, unfortunately, I've only seen The Cocktail Party once. It's pretty hard to find it. But when it was announced that Celia has been killed in Africa, martyred in Africa, the audience was stunned. The human reality of that impacted the audience in such a way. And so they didn't take it as, oh, well, now she's being martyred because that's what has to happen in order to make the whole cosmology work, or whatever, the theology work. That's not the way it works. And it really came across as a moving and human event. So, yes, I agree what you're saying, and I see what you're saying, and yet at the same time, I think because it's a play, it might make a difference. That's all. Yeah.
Oh, no, that's a very, thank you. I mean, that actually reminds me of a friend of mine wrote very dense and elusive poetry. When I first time I read one of his poems, I thought it was a car park for illusions. But when he actually performed it, it just came alive
Yeah.
in an extraordinary way.
Yeah, well, that's what Eliot said too. We know what poetry's saying before we know what it's saying. I don't know if you know the American baseball player Yogi Berra. He has a great, things like nobody goes there anymore because it's too crowded. Things like that, which fit language together and don't that means something that simultaneously doesn't mean anything. And the idea that you know what poetry's saying before you know what it's saying is what Eliot suggested, because somebody brings it to life for you. Yeah, it's very true. Yeah.
Thanks for that, Mike. You might come back with some more questions in a moment, but I just wonder about, within the book, you get this whole business about the First World War and the defeat, their defeat, and the resentment of having a defeat, whoever they blame for that, and there's a lot of blame going on, and that's leading up to Hitler, obviously. Is there any? Do you find there's anything in the book about the victors of the war, or does Lucy leave that?
I mean, and by the way, I do hope, Lucy, if I got anything wrong or there's anything I've misrepresented by the necessary abridgment that the paper has to do, please correct me. There is a wonderful passage when Max tells his teacher, Dr. Fisher, that he's going to visit England on this Bach St. Matthew Passion tour. And Max already has some English, and Dr. Fisher tells him what the English are like. He says the English are terribly polite, but they will be very patronizing. You will feel very sorry for you, but gently make you realize that they're right. So yeah, we do get a bit of a sense that, and also, of course, in a way, Poland was victor in the war, and that's certainly a source of the huge tension. There's a terrible row over a dinner party between Max's older brother Heinrich and Max's best friend Adam Zapolsky. Of course, he's half Polish, half Austrian, and Adam behaves very, very well and apologizes to the boorish Heinrich, partly because he sees how hurt he is by defeat. They reach a sort of agreement of Germany for the Germans and Poland for the Poles, but of course, in Heinrich's case, it will be an absolute and murderous ethnic identification.
Thanks again for that. the postcard intrigues me, and the names on the postcard. It's always a little difficult to ask about how somebody has structured the book when the person is listening to us. However, do you think the book is structured in a way with each of the figures on the postcard, each of the names on the postcard, actually having a representation of a viewpoint, of a philosophical viewpoint?
I do, but as I say, the case always against intellectual novels is that they just become cardboard cutouts, as per our discussion just now, and a very helpful corrective from Mike Collins. So I think they do to some extent. I mean, Adam is the atheist who then is the radical convert, and he's just as absolute in his Catholicism. I mean, then as it were, going the whole way and becoming a priest. It reminds me of something somebody wrote about Edith Stein, who was also from Breslau, Wrocław, of course, Jewish, an atheist from her teenage years into her 20s, and then receives the gift of faith in God, receives Christian faith in reading St. Teresa of Avila, and becomes a Carmelite nun. And this commentator said that atheism is the last stop on the journey to absolute faith. So I think Adam is a bit one of those characters. Treuburg is he's the practical one. Halperin, he sort of disappears, of course. But I don't know, I find him the most, I mean, he's a difficult man, but he is actually a fascinatingly complex character in that, as it were, he's tried everything. He's tried religion, he's tried all these ideologies. He now thinks that brain experiments might be helpful in determining what is the right music. But then it's interesting how he responds when Adam reveals his vocation to the priesthood, and Halpern acknowledges, yeah, maybe we need good priests and good rabbis. But in the end, of course, Halpern is very, I mean, he's actually at some stage, Max just says, oh, he's just absolutely the rabbi giving his sermon. And for all his apparent atheism, it is completely unacceptable to Jakob that his little sister Anna could probably become a Catholic and marry Max. And he just uses his clout and sends her home. That's very shocking. And there is sort of a bit of indirect after story, and eventually we find out that Anna marries a rabbi. She sends a very lovely note to Max. Sorry, you're Anna. But actually, if you want to find out more about Jakob Halpern, you need to read the sequel, which is a beautiful novel, Leaves Are Falling, which is actually the story of Jakob's son, who escaped to Britain, was a refugee. It's rather uncomfortable being a refugee and you're on a Yorkshire farm with an ex-Nazi. But yeah, read the second novel for that. It's fantastic.
Okay. You just remind me that, though, in speaking there, that of course Wallace Stevens was a confirmed atheist. His poem Sunday Morning is, we live in an old chaos of the sun, of island solitude, unsponsored, free of that wide water inescapable. It was a statement of atheism, a strong statement of atheism. But then on his deathbed, apparently, he became a Catholic.
Really?
So,
Gosh.
Yeah.
If I could say a last thing, what I really love that Lucy's done, I think she has dismantled the image of the Catholic Church, as however nice and sophisticated and kind it might be, as basically yet another totalitarian state. It's not absolutizing. It is actually holding people together in a search for truth, which opens to a transcendent infinity, that actually opens to a loving God. And with all its flaws and human weaknesses and disgraceful behavior. So I really love that, actually. It's not just an intellectual game.
Okay, thank you, Father Dominic. Such a stimulating paper, and thank you, Lucy, if you're still listening, for such a stimulating novel and wonderful novel.
Thank you, Lucy.
For everyone else, I would thank Mike Collins as well for his incisive question. I hope you'll join us next week on Monday the 27th of October when Professor Kate Crosby from Oxford University will be telling us about an Irish Buddhist who took on the British Empire. So that's next week, Monday, the 27th of October, and to hear Professor Kate Crosby. Please note that seminar or that talk site will start at 3 p.m. UK time, 3 p.m. UK time, as the clocks will have gone back in the UK, but they won't have gone back in the USA. So it's still 11 a.m. in the USA, but 3 p.m. UK time next week. We have an interesting talk in our free speech at the International Crossroads coming up on this Wednesday, the 22nd of October, asking the question about who writes or who rewrites history. So that's, and where is free speech located in either? So that's an interesting one coming up on the 22nd of October with an extremely good panel. I'd like to thank Georgetown University for supporting the series, especially Vice President of Global Affairs, Tom Banchoff. Thanks also to the administrators at Georgetown, Julie Murillo and Mary Gordon. And my thanks to Mike Collins for his participation and his support for this series throughout. I'd also like to thank Blackfriars Hall for their support, John O'Connor, the Regent, Richard Finn, the Director of Studies, and of course our prior, who happens to be Father Dominic White. So thank you, Dominic. I'm Mike Scott from Blackfriars Hall in Oxford. You can follow me on LinkedIn at Professor Michael Scott and on Facebook as Michael Kerr Scott. Thank you all for joining us. Hope to see you on Wednesday and hope to see you again next Monday. Thank you very much and bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dominic. Bye.
Thank you. Thank you, Mike. Both Mikes.
Yeah.
Bye.